Good morning and welcome to your Chapter 1 lecture from Economic Logic. Hopefully, you've had a chance to get your book. If you have not gotten your textbook yet, let me know. Or if you've got it ordered online, because obviously you can get this textbook online for a bit cheaper than you can in the bookstore. I know that's kind of taboo for me to say, but it saves you money. I know when I was going through college, it was pretty important to me. It still is very important to me. So I try my best to make sure that your textbook costs stay a little bit lower. Now, when we start these lectures, make sure you have your notes. I'll always have some blank notes for you. Obviously, if it doesn't help you, they're not required. It's not like I'm going to have you turn them in at the end of a semester, but they will help some of you. They go right along with the PowerPoints. You write them down, and as they say, repetition, 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 and you end up remembering a lot more. It'd also be helpful for whatever book we happen to be using for this lecture. So in this case, we have Economic Logic. You can already see in the first slide here says refer to page 8, figure 1.1. So there is going to be some times during these lectures that I will point to a specific point in your book for reference versus trying to put up all these different charts and stuff when I can just have you look in the very textbook that you had to get. Anyways, so these first few chapters here should actually be some review for you because you have to have had macroeconomics to be in microeconomics here at Delta anyway. And I don't recall getting any of those, what the heck are those things called? Uh, Notices that somebody hasn't taken macro. I normally have to sign off for them. Now, I try to teach this from the standpoint that every teacher has different teaching styles, so I won't assume that you know everything. So obviously, when we get to those points, I'm not just gonna blow right through them just because it was something that should have been in macro. Because obviously every teacher could hit different points within that, which actually brings me to something that's actually quite important. I don't know if it's been brought up in an economics course for you before, but there's a lot of schools of thought within economics. Uh, the one that I'm going to be teaching from this particular class for micro is the Austrian school of thought. So it's more of the free market ideals. And that's actually where Mark Skousen, your textbook author, as well as the antitrust author, both of those economists come from that particular school of thought. Now, that school of thought is not mainstream. Now, macroeconomics goes very, very heavily right along with that mainstream economic line of thought, often called Keynesianism or neo-Keynesianism. Now, we'll touch a little bit on it in this class, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. If you had me for macro, or if you had just about the majority of all the other teachers out there, I can only name a few off the top of my head that are in the local area that would teach from the Austrian School of Thought if you're not at Northwood University, which that's the predominant school of thought. They teach there. So, macro, you've probably already been exposed to that whole Keynesian economic school of thought. In fact, Keynes himself technically came up with gross domestic product, and he was the one that really got us on to watching the level of unemployment and things like that. Now, really quick, I have to admit it was really, really tempting to start this lecture with a recording of somebody speaking Chinese, since you saw in my introduction that I actually teach full time over in China. I'm actually from the Midland area, and about half my life I spent down in the Detroit area, and the other half up here in Midland. So I actually can't speak any Chinese yet, but I do plan on learning some of it this year. My wife has actually started learning it using an app already, so she's pretty excited about taking that on. Anyway, let's get on to chapter 1 here. So why do we study economics? Well, there's a lot of different reasons we could really step back and look at and go, well, this is why we look at it. But in reality, we study economics because we want to figure out ways to improve our circumstances. How can we make things better for everyone? Now, we can take different points of economics and go, well, we can attack it from how can we get more people out of poverty, or how can we make everyone better off? Now, if you go and you study what the Chinese government's trying to do, they're trying to make the entire economy increase to a point where it raises more people out of poverty. Deng Xiaoping, a previous emperor or president of China, you got to go back to the 70s and 80s to see him in power, but he was the one that actually initially started the opening up of China. So the whole idea of free trade with the world. And he figured out that, oh, if we get rid of part of these systems from the socialist economic type of running, we get this whole boost to the economy. And when you boost the entire economy, you make everyone better off. So millions upon millions of people, more than any time in history in that short of a period of time, were raised out of poverty in China. And actually during that time, we see this sort of capitalist revolution going on throughout the entire world, where tons and tons of people are gaining access to the market that never had access to the market before. So you have all these people being raised out of poverty, and things are getting much better. So that's one of the big reasons why we study economics. We want to find those better ways of running the economy. How can we make things better for everyone? How can we make things easier for everyone? How can we increase the quality, the quantity, the variety of all these different goods and services that we all have access to? Now, there's different ways we can actually look at the world and see whether or not things are improving. On page 8, figure 1.1, we see this general increase of wages. So how much we are actually getting paid as individuals compared to how much we actually have to work. And through the years, we've gained all these efficiencies in the workplace that has made our jobs and, quite frankly, our lives significantly better and easier to go through. And because of that, we're making more money per hour worked than we used to before. Now, other ways we can look at it, we can look at it on a material gained standpoint. So we look over at figure 1.2 and figure 1.3 on page 9, and we see that the living standards between 1900 and 1970 have increased significantly because of the various things that people have access to these days. So flushing toilets, we went from 15% to 99% of people having access. Running water, we went from 24% to 92%. Central heating, we went from 1% to 58%. And you can go through the rest of that list and you can just see these large improvements. And it starts kind of going back against a lot of the rhetoric that you hear coming out of some politicians these days, or even see in some newspapers that are telling us, hey, poverty is getting worse. Things are getting worse around the world. But the data does not actually support that point of view. You got to remember, when we talk about poverty, poverty is an arbitrary number. So we take a dart and we throw it against the wall and we go, that is the level that is poverty. We look at the level of poverty through the United States at this point, and we see that it's actually quite a high level when compared to other countries. So if we can, so the level of poverty here in the United States, let's just say, is considered 32,000. It's somewhere around that number. If we went to the countries in Africa, we'd see that $32,000 a year could be considered the middle class over there. That would be significantly better living standards for them than what they're seeing here, and we consider that poverty here. And it really starts to blur the lines and kind of make things all muddled up. So how do we look at it and go, how do we improve things for all these individuals if we've already considered the poverty line to be so high? So is poverty a situation where it's somebody that doesn't have a home, doesn't have access to food, or is it somebody that has access to all those things but can't afford, say, the highest speed of internet, can't afford to have that house with the extra bathroom, and so on? Because $32,000 a year, obviously, if you are responsible with your money, you can actually do quite well in most parts of the United States. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule, of course, because we can go over into parts of California where it's significantly more expensive to live, or New York itself. Obviously, apartments can be outrageous there, and so on. But if you were to move out of those areas, you could live decently comfortably at that level. So it makes us sit back and think, it's like, where should we actually be putting this line? So how can we make it to the point where it's like, well, this is a level that is low enough to where this is people that are in need. These are people that need to be helped. And how can we attack those reasons why they are there, not the symptoms? That is really, really important. So how can we raise them out of that poor situation and not just paper it over with various things like food stamps or other programs that we have out there, welfare or whatever? Those are just treating symptoms. They're not actually raising those people out of the situation they're in, because they end up becoming dependent on that particular program to get by. And sometimes those programs can actually trap them in that situation. But we'll get into some of that in later on chapters. So even if we step back and we look at poverty on a global basis, we see that it has significantly declined over the past 200 years. So compare somebody who's in a rough situation today to somebody that was in a rough situation in the 1800s, and you see a significantly different picture. The situation has changed dramatically. It's really hard to even imagine. So you have situations where we here in the United States have access to running water, and we have decent electricity access, all these different things. Well, some of those things weren't even around yet back then, and yet all of us have access to it. Now just look at how many people have cars in the United States, and it's mind-boggling to see how far we have actually come. Now another figure that you can take a look at is figure 1.5. And it's basically just going to demonstrate a lot of the same things that we have already talked about. So if you'd like to take a look at that, go ahead and look at it on your own time. So let's look at this, the next point now. So not everyone is participating in the miracle of increasing prosperity. There's millions of people who are still in really low incomes. There's still these people that seem to have been kind of left behind. Now, even though some of the conditions for many of these people has still improved when compared to history, we still have this situation where it seems as if the system is actually leaving people behind. So why do we think that some countries have not improved as fast as, or as near fast as, some other countries? Now, there's an interesting thing to look at here in the world, because as I was just saying a little bit ago, we had this capitalistic revolution throughout the world. So countries throughout the world were all improving. Countries throughout the world were opening up. They were deregulating. People that had access to, never had access to opening a business suddenly can open up a business. We saw that happen in, say, the ending of the Soviet Union. We've seen that happen and opening up in China. We even seen it happening in various countries in Europe, such as Portugal, Poland, any of the Soviet bloc countries, obviously, and so on. But yet some of these countries that seem to went through these free market capitalistic reforms did not grow as fast as all these other countries, like the United States, or how fast England, after England did their big deregulation. Yeah, believe it or not, England was a very socialistic country if you go back to the 70s and earlier. Actually, the period between World War II and basically when Margaret Thatcher takes over there was a quite strongly a socialistic country in England. But anyway, they went through these big reforms and they saw major growth rates came out, major improvements, and lots of people being raised out of poverty in these countries. But yet there were some countries that seemed to be left behind, such as Portugal. Portugal had gone through all of these different reforms, and yet they didn't seem to grow like everyone else. And it left quite a few economists mind-boggling. There's actually a book that was dedicated strictly to figuring that out, that whole thing out, and it's called The Mystery of Capital by Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto actually decided to just take that on as his big task. He just didn't understand why these countries that seem to have done these free market reforms did not get the results that history has shown us they should have got. So he went to the economists and said, "What do you think this is?" And of course, they weren't really that sure. And then he went to the governments, and the government officials were not all that sure. He even started going to individuals within a business owners and things like that, interviewing and talking with them, and he wasn't really getting anywhere. Well, one day he was in Portugal, and he was walking with a farmer. And as he was walking, different dogs started barking at him, depending on where he stepped. So the dogs were marking the territory, depending on where you are. So if you're on this dog owner's property, this dog bark. You go on to the next one, the new dog starts barking at you and letting you know you're trespassing. You've gone over onto somebody else's property, which made him think, do these people have defined property rights? And he immediately went to the farmer and said, "Do you have property rights then?" And the farmer wasn't entirely sure what his question was at first. He goes, "Well, yeah, we know whose property's here." And so Hernando de Soto defined it more. He said, "Do you have a deed? Do you have something that actually proves you own this property?" And he found out the answer was no. They had no way to prove that they owned that property. They didn't have true defined private property rights. There was no records of who owned property, whether it be buildings, land, or even the farming goods that these individuals were producing. They had no way to prove that they owned it. And you may be thinking, it's like, well, what's the big deal on that? Well, in reality, you're actually being cut off from the capital in capitalism when you don't have private property. Because how can you prove to the bank you own that house or you own that land to take out a mortgage to start a business or to take out a mortgage to invest and grow your company? How can you prove that those farming goods that you've got are actually yours, or heavy machinery, cars, whatever it may be? How can you prove those are yours? You can't without the private property, and that cuts you off from a lot of the places in the world marketplace. There's a lot of companies that aren't going to buy from you because they don't know if those goods have been stolen. They don't know if you actually produce those or own those. So we found out that all these countries that seem to be left behind by the capitalistic revolution left out this huge pillar, this major important part in making sure that the market will work, and that is private property rights. So economics is the study of wealth and how it is created or diminished. That's one of the better definitions I've actually seen of economics. So what actually makes things better versus eats away at things that we have already created? So the creation of wealth, income, living standards, and the production and distributions of goods and services. Now, what is wealth? Well, wealth consists of actual material possessions and services and things like that. It's not necessarily money. So just because you're rich doesn't mean, in money anyways, doesn't mean you're actually wealthy. So if you have a lot of assets, then all of a sudden you would end up into the wealthy category. So, which brings us back to money. So, money is a medium of exchange. All it does is facilitates the wealth creation process. It's not actually wealth in itself. And if you know anything, if you remember anything from your macroeconomics class, if you just have a government start printing more of that money, you can see that value of that money just diminish, and it can happen really, really quick if the government really messes things up. So just because your income increases doesn't necessarily mean your wealth has been increased. So I'll give you an example. So say you had a pay increase of 3% for the year. And then you also had an inflation rate of 3%. So the value of those dollars that you were being paid in diminished by 3% over that same period that you had an income increase of 3%. So technically your income is at break even. You haven't really gained anything. Now if we take a few other factors into consideration, like your savings account. So during that same year, your income stayed the same after we account inflation, but what happened to your savings account? If you didn't have an interest rate of at least 3%, which would be a really high interest rate on your bank account actually lost value. And that counts the same as any money you've got sitting into your safe at home or in your wallet. All of that lost 3% of its purchasing power. So the dollar represents just the store of value of previous work. And that store of value, depending on how either the market, if the market's providing the money like you see in cryptocurrencies these days, or if the government's providing money, are they being responsible when they provide that? And then, of course, what is the supply and demand for that money? Because money doesn't get exempted from the laws of supply and demand. Supply and demand are also going to decide what the value of money is. So if the government decides to greatly increase the supply of money, the price of said money would decrease. The value of said money would decrease. The previous stored work you have in there would diminish. So does ripping up a dollar remove materials from the classroom? So if we were in a classroom setting right now and I were to rip up this dollar to the point where I could not exchange it in to get a new one and throw it onto the ground in front of you, did I destroy wealth? I did not destroy any wealth in that case, because I didn't go and destroy a desk. I didn't vandalize the board or destroy the dry erase board, throw away markers, use up things. If I'd done something like that, wealth would be destroyed. Now, when you rip up a dollar, you're technically redistributing wealth. Because as I said before, money's value is decided by supply and demand. So if you decrease the supply by ripping up the dollar, all of your dollars increased in value. Now in reality, there's so many dollars out there. There's trillions and trillions of dollars that are in our system. It's to the point where unless we were in that classroom was closed off for the economy, and we only had the dollars that were in our wallets that we could use in that particular classroom, the value of that dollar is not going to change by me tearing up that dollar. So the only person that's going to be out anything is I'm going to be out that $1, and that's it. But if we had that closed classroom system, there's only, say, we may only have $300 between all of us in that classroom, especially these days, considering how much of us use plastic to pay for everything, credit cards, debit cards, etc. So you may see a dramatic increase of the value of the dollars in that class because you could say, well, 0.3% of all the dollars just vanished from circulation in that classroom. But obviously that doesn't represent a real world example and situation. So how do the factors of production impact wealth? So the definition of wealth implies that goods and services must be useful and practical to consumers to add value. And this is important to consider. So if you produce something that nobody wants, or it's a shoddy good or service compared to all the other goods and services that are on the market, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to sell that. So you may be willing to supply that good or service, but that doesn't immediately mean there's going to be a demand for that good or service on the other end. So it has to be useful and practical to consumers to add that value. Otherwise, there is no value being added. So finished consumer products include food, clothing, cars, houses, etc. And then, of course, services would include medical care, financial services, education, and maintenance. And any of these things that are actually adding value. So they're practical, they're useful, and people are demanding them and want them, paying for those services. That's adding to wealth in society. Now, value is placed on unfinished products such as raw land, iron ore, forests, commodities, all sorts of different things. And we can also look at unfinished products that are partially through the production line. So if you have a steel frame for a car, but you haven't put all the other parts on that, those parts don't suddenly just lose all their value, because there's people that still demand those items. So there's people that want and have uses for those particular items. So if you were producing those steel frames and then for some reason you ran into a situation where your car plant's going out of business, there's a dang good chance that another automotive plant is going to pick it up. And if another automotive plant doesn't pick it up, the scrapyard darn well will, because they're going to come and get that steel, and then they're going to turn it into scrap metal and sell it onto the marketplace to other producers that use steel. So unfinished goods and services can have value to them as long as it's something that we can actually use further along in a productive process. Now, unfinished products are obtained from the land and are produced using capital goods, and the unfinished products are then turned into finished products through the use of land, labor, and capital goods being brought together by entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is your fourth factor of production, of course. The other three being land, capital, labor. The entrepreneur goes out there and they seek out those things where they can create value for others. So they go out and go, oh, this product here is something that people could really use, and I'm pretty sure that they would want it. So they go out and they put together the land, the capital, and the labor all together to produce that good or service to the absolute best of their ability at the lowest cost that they possibly can, and then turn around and try to sell it for that profit. And the profit, of course, if they do it correctly, and it's something that the market actually wanted, and you created value for all of your customers, you'll turn that profit, and that profit is the payment for the work that you put into it, the payment for the risk that you took to go on to that business venture. Now, the fact that consumer goods command value implies the means of production also would command value. Now, this can be a little bit confusing to think about, but say you have a car that you want to buy. So the car obviously has value to it because a lot of us need a car to drive to work, to get around, take vacations, etc. Whatever you want to use the vehicle for. There's even vehicle collectors out there. So, because you want those cars, and there's not a great enough supply without somebody producing more cars to meet the needs of everyone, the goods that are going in to making that car also have value because they have use in the productive process. So steel, because we have uses for steel to make other goods, steel has value. Glass is needed for the windows of the car. And because we need the windows for that car, glass has value. Now, all these things have obviously multitudes of different uses. Glass is used for windows and housing and flashlights. I mean, we can go through a ridiculous amount of different things for that, along with steel as well. And because we have all these different uses, steel and glass and iron ore or whatever other input we want to look at has that value because we need it for those productive processes. Now, is labor wealth? So, people use their physical and mental powers to produce useful goods and services. If you, as a person, did not know how to do something, so you wanted to start a business and you wanted to produce, say, a car, since we've been using that example, and you don't know how to create that car, you don't have the labor capital in a way, so you don't have the knowledge to do so. If we go far enough back in history, we have all of these different resources available to us. So you had iron, you had copper, you had oil, you had all these different things. I mean, you go far enough back, you can see periods where oil was laying actually on the ground. And when we start talking about Standard Oil way back in the 1800s, the oil in Pennsylvania was literally sitting on top of the ground, and you could take it up. There's just so much of it. That's where the oil boom started. But even though for eons people have had access to that oil, they've seen it, they had no idea what to use it for. We didn't know how to refine it down into fuels, let alone did we know what to use those fuels for yet. So if we don't have the human capital, we don't have the knowledge, we can't do anything with those. So you have to have the mental power to be able to do the business venture you want to take on as well, or get a hold of other individuals that have that skill or have that knowledge that can work with you to create those goods and services, or know how to use those raw materials. If nobody knows how to do it, so maybe you say, oh, I want to make a business that takes people to Pluto, that enigma that's either a planet or an asteroid or whatever they want to call it these days. There really isn't anyone on Earth currently, at least that we know of, that could easily get people there and back in a reasonable amount of time where you could actually make a business venture out of doing so. Now, there's other ways you could obviously make money by getting a vehicle all the way out to Pluto, like taking back samples and things like that. I'm sure universities and other scientific associations would pay a great deal for something like that, because something like that's never been done before. But that right there is the point. It's never been done before, and we don't know how to do it. So we need to know how to actually be able to do these things in order for us to turn around and actually turn our labor into wealth. So just because something has a lot of labor in it doesn't necessarily mean it's valuable. Now, a nation's wealth is measured in large part by the knowledge and skills and effort of the labor force. It's no secret that the labor force here in the United States is one of the most productive here in the world. And it's been that way for a while now. And because of that, it's helped contribute greatly to our wealth creation process in this country. So labor is a significant contributor to wealth. But there's a tripping point here, which is the labor theory of value. And the labor theory of value comes from Karl Marx. Karl Marx being often called the father of socialism. Karl Marx believed that products all get their value from labor. So the more labor you put into a particular product, the more value it has. And of course, that is not true. Value is perceived by individuals and is different from person to person, for one thing, and also the other three factors of production play a key part in making the products as well. Uh, it's also really important to consider this point. So, say we have a couple of different companies that are making cars. So, you have one company that's highly mechanized and they have some very skillful workers, and they are able to make this car with, say, 100 hours of labor. I'm just throwing that number out there. It's not an actual number. So 100 hours of labor went into this car made by that company. Now let's take this other company. This other company has people that really don't know what they're doing when they're making cars. And they end up putting 1,000 hours into the car, and the car doesn't run. So the car that was made by one company with 100 hours in it can run. It's useful. The other car with 1,000 hours into it, it doesn't run. It's useless. So the one with the 100 hours into it, even though the labor theory of value would say would be less valuable, is the one that actually has value to us here in society. It's going to be demanded. It has uses. We want that car. While the other car, well, it's going to sell for scrap. Or maybe sell to somebody that can put another 100 hours into it and actually make it run. So just because you have more hours into something doesn't mean it's more valuable. So wealth is created from transforming unfinished goods towards final use by consumers. And this is how the process of wealth creation goes. So what should be produced? Consumer goods or capital goods? So the entrepreneur sits back and goes, well, what need is there out in society that I can fulfill? Can I make capital goods that other producers need to make their final goods for consumers? Or can I make a final good? Which brings us, of course, to whom should the products and services be produced for? Consumers or producers. How much should be produced? How much demand is there for those goods and services, whether they be capital or the final goods for end use? How should goods be produced? What materials? What processes? How much labor? How much machinery? How much financial capital are we going to have to put together for this? Who is going to do it? Etc. And the entrepreneur, again, is going to have to make all of these different decisions or get individuals that will help them make these different decisions. But in the end, it's going to come back on them. And then, of course, when should it be produced? And how long will it take to produce it? In this example, of course, in the PowerPoint, it's like, how long will it take to build that building? Will it take us a year, 2 years, or will it take us 2 weeks? Now, natural resources go to intermediate goods and services to final goods and services. So that's kind of the way it goes. So it goes natural resources to, you turn them into intermediate goods, and then we turn it into final goods and services. And we do so by answering all of the different questions in the previous slide. The basic purpose, of course, of economic activity is to turn those unfinished, unusable goods into actual usable goods. Now, is economics only concerned with material goods? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy. So Maslow's hierarchy is this pyramid. And at the very bottom of that pyramid, we have these biological and physiological needs, the actual needs to survive, clothing, food, water. And then above that, we want this feeling of safety. Then the next tier, we want a feeling of belongingness. And then it goes up to, we want things that make us feel good about what we're doing. So we want to be awarded and recognized. So that's your esteem category. Then, of course, the top of the pyramid is self-actualization. We want to feel good about what we're doing for society. So, uh, are you doing community service? Is your company helping the environment? There's all sorts of different things that can hit that category. And Maslow said that in order to care about the needs higher up on the pyramid, you have to fulfill the needs at the bottom. So you're not really too concerned about the environment, say, if you are extremely worried about where you're going to get your next meal or where you're going to get water. Those very basic needs that are going to keep you alive are going to be the ones that grab your attention first. So, in order to survive, individuals must take care of their base needs, economic security. Now, most economic concerns are directly related, of course, to those biological, physical, and safety needs. And many of the things we look at, so how do we make sure that everyone has water? How do we get people out of poverty and make sure that they have access to food, housing, clothing, and then, of course, higher quality levels of all of those different things? How can we continue to make all those different things better? So a lot of economics, of course, is very concerned with those things, because there are still people in the world that don't have access to easy electricity. There are a very small percentage of people in the world still that don't have easy access to clean water. So, how can we make it to where people like that all have that access too? But that's not the only thing we are actually concerned with in economics. We do talk about how we can get people to enjoy their business ventures a bit, and we do talk, we can actually get in quite a bit into various things that get into self-actualization. You can actually major in environmental economics if you go into a graduate program. So we are concerned with the environment. We are concerned with, of course, the opportunity costs, externalities, all these different things. I mean, in economics, we could even get into a detailed talk about noise pollution, not just, actual pollution to the environment from CO2 or melting plastics, etc. Now, morality in economics, economists try to avoid moral judgments. And you're going to see that a lot when we start talking about monopolies, because one of the monopolies we are going to look at is American tobacco. And obviously, there's some major moral issues with American tobacco. American tobacco is creating a product that causes cancer and kills people, etc. And it would be the same thing if we talked about alcohol or marijuana. All these different things have negative health effects. I mean, we can also talk about high fatty foods and McDonald's and things like that. But when we talk about the business itself, a lot of times we're not going to be talking about those specific points, and that's going to be important to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about monopoly. We're going to look at it, it's like, did the economic activity improve the lives of quite a few people, etc. And like I said, we'll get into a lot more detail with that when we get into monopolies. So some other important areas of interest in economics is income and wealth distribution, waste and pollution, and of course, the role of government. So that is the end of chapter 1. I will be posting chapters 2 and 3 together in the next lecture, and it should be up very shortly. Thanks for listening.